Thanks to Ayun and all the organizers for, not least most immediately memorably, a really quite enjoyable lunch. My paper is entitled Traffic Light, Post-Cage Discourses on Silence. Believe it or not, you are looking at the member of a dance faculty right now. John Cage, in a 1991 interview: "When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue in Manhattan, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting, and I love the activity of sound. I don't need sound to talk to me." Thomas DeLeo, in an interview with Tracy Wiggins: "For Cage, silence is the space in which all unintended sound comes into play. However, my sense of silence is different. Silence is like a location for the experience of sound. For me, it defines place with respect to sound. My silence frames sound, isolates it, and creates an opportunity to hear sound both as an object, an entity unto itself, divorced from its role as a mere unit of linguistic baggage, as well as part of a process of evolution." Stuart Saunders Smith's commentary number 1 from Links number 5, Sitting on the Edge of Nothing for Three Percussionists: "What is there to write in the silence? That it is not golden, it's white. That it is not empty, it's listening. I find no rest in silence. It is an isn't being an is." And from Smith's The Such Falling Voice, Movement 4: "In the north, I am sitting in the dark, waiting for the silence of the light." It's indisputable that John Cage's work has forced many musicians to address their relationship to silence. This paper examines the function and importance of silence in the work of two composers who knew Cage and who were generally sympathetic to his work and thought, but who ultimately use Cage as a landmark to define, in large part, where their work does not reside. The combined efforts of Cage, Thomas DeLeo, and Stuart Saunders Smith make up a significant part of the rich web of philosophy, influence, difference, and dialectic on the uses of silence in music, the effect of silence on memory, the use of musical silence as a means of control, and the responsibilities of listeners confronted with silence. An aside: the post-Cage designation in the title of this paper is problematic, insofar as DeLeo's and Smith's mature works are contemporaneous with Cage's later works. It might be more accurate to describe DeLeo's and Smith's work as post-433, since 433 is the Cage work that opened this vista of inquiry more so than any other. But given the prominence of 433 in general musical perceptions of Cage's output, it might be a distinction without a difference, and whatever the designation post-Cage sacrifices in strict accuracy is made up for through concision and spoken facility. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, post-Cage is the worst possible solution except for all of the others that I tried. Thomas DeLeo is professor of music at the University of Maryland in College Park. In addition to his work as a composer, he's also an important music theorist, author, and editor. Between he and Smith, it's DeLeo's work that invites the most immediate comparison to Cage's late music, especially the time bracket works, in their generous proportion of silence to sound, and in the terms in which DeLeo discusses them. In his seminal essay, The Complexity of Experience, DeLeo states that he, quote, "would like to be rid of gesture and process and get sound back clean." Regarding his 1991 piece Between for flute and percussion, DeLeo lists his aesthetic objectives, which include replacing development and evolution with presentation and ridding sound of gesture. So far, so Cagean, but DeLeo soon elucidates the differences between his approach and Cage's To wit, I continue, of course, to use long silences, and so place each sound event on a trajectory moving toward isolation. And furthermore, quote, typically, my compositions are constructed from discrete segments of music which, although they coexist as a group, never become fixed with respect to one another through hierarchical relationships. In this respect, my pieces are never organic. I strive for this condition in order to avoid as much as possible the expression of subjective priorities from which such hierarchies are engendered. In addition, I always try to avoid constructing transitions linking individual events. I avoid anything which might convey a sense of continuity and connection. I desire everything to be segmented, halted, separated. I have no interest in memory, which seems to me an illusion. Only the direct perception of the moment seems important to me, end quote. This line of thought thoroughly pervades DeLeo's work. The third page of his 1992 piece, Not, for percussion and piano, illustrates these ideas as well as any other. The page provides notation for 21 seconds of the work. 16 of those seconds in the first system contain sound, piano, vibraphone, and one chime note, all marked triple piano. DeLeo indicates that the initial group of instrumental attacks should be completed before 5 seconds pass. The next 2 attacks in the piano follow after approximately 7 seconds of uninterrupted decay. The last 5 seconds of the page are silent. DeLeo asks that all resonating instruments be dampened simultaneously at the end of the first system. Feldman's influence is readily apparent in the choice of instruments and dynamic, as well as the generous time allowed for the enjoyment of the instrument's decay, though of course it should be noted that while DeLeo does acknowledge the deep influence of Feldman on his music, DeLeo's music regularly uses the full conventional dynamic spectrum, as well as percussion instruments not normally associated with Feldman, such as claves and tom-toms, etc. What is most striking to me about this passage is the way that DeLeo seems committed to actively managing the listener's relationship to silence. As a post-Webern, post-Cage, post-Feldman composer, DeLeo surely understands the conventionality of the first 5 seconds of this passage, its chromaticism, its texture, and so on, but it becomes something uniquely his at the end of the first system, where the 2 piano attacks punctuate, or indeed puncture, that sonic decay right before all of the sound is taken out. This is a passage written by a composer who is intently interested in demonstrating the gradations of near silence that approach and meet silence, and who is willing to do so in near finger-pointing fashion. DeLeo's use of silence extends beyond microscopic textural moments such as this. He also uses carefully measured periods of silence as an element of structure, and this idea represents one of his most direct borrowings from Cage. A large number of Cage's early works have structures governed by patterns of duration, most prominently using the square root formula. And Cage notably observed that the primacy of duration as a musico-structural element is due to duration being the only parameter that silence shares with sound. DeLeo's works often have structures governed by intersecting fields of sound and silence, whose durations expand, contract, or remain constant with respect to each other. And DeLeo has said to me that he feels that the macroscopic actions of these fields, growing, shrinking, interfering with, and impinging upon one another, is in large part what gives his compositions their internal energy. An illuminating example of this is found in one of DeLeo's recent works, Et Avant Image, for 9 percussionists and flute, premiered in February of 2012 at the University of Akron. Et Avant Image is typical of DeLeo's work in several ways. Players are spatially located throughout the hall, in and around the audience, according to a specific scheme. The percussionists speak and whisper phonemes as well as fragments of text, in this case a text of Mallarmé, which is a very common choice for DeLeo. And percussion instruments are chosen to offer the composer sonic options along several parameters, including frequency from low to high, harmonicity from pitch-centered to noisy, and in bandwidth from narrow to wideband frequency production. These three tables give the durations in seconds of alternating periods of sound and silence in each major section of A avant image. Most of these periods have borders that are relatively easy to define. Parentheses mark instances where it's hard to determine the precise starting moment of the silence in question, usually due to a decaying resonating percussion instrument. The flute plays only in section 2. It's easy to discern the general character of each major section. Section 1 consists of 4 relatively short episodes of sound, alternating with periods of silence, which comparatively are generally much longer. Section 2 inverts this relationship, alternating 3 significantly and increasingly longer periods of sound with brief periods of silence, each precisely the same length. Section 3 contains the most complex durational interplay between sound and silence. Sounding periods are initially moderate in length before becoming shorter and finally much longer, while the durations of the silences follow a roughly inverse trajectory. The methodology of this formal scheme shares little with Cage's techniques, but one is hard-pressed to find a composer giving the same kind of committed thought to silence and durational structure as DeLeo. And you can see here a portion of the score from A avant image showing the 3rd and 4th sounding periods from section 1. Another aside. DeLeo's music provides a nearly ideal venue in which to interrogate the European versus American dichotomy in art music of the last half-century. Some scholars delight in their advocacy for one of these sides at the expense of the other. For example, Kyle Gann is both jubilant and indignant in his American reclaiming of Henry Cowell's new musical resources after its ideas make it to Darmstadt via John Cage and David Tudor, only to be used by Boulez and Stockhausen and subsequently passed off as their own. Obviously, the Cage-DeLeo relationship I've discussed here differs markedly from that situation. DeLeo is an American who studied in America, teaches in America, and openly acknowledges his debt to Cage for just these things. And in fact, Chris Schultes drafts DeLeo onto Team Cage, as it were, in his excellent essay, The Dialectics of Experimentalism, which extends the 1950s Cage-Boulez binary opposition to the present day in the persons of Tom DeLeo and Brian Fernyhough. For me, DeLeo's music inhabits a space where European-American and modernist, postmodernist modes of thinking don't operate clearly. Here's DeLeo, carefully crafting these minutely detailed sound events, treating sound and silence as binary opposing forces, making ownership claims such as my silence frames sound, using acoustic instruments to recreate the effect of electronic music a la Xenakis or Sorotsky, and otherwise doing just about everything I'd expect a European-trained modernist to do, but when he talks about where his music comes from, the American experimental tradition stands at the fore. It's a very interesting and useful tension. Also intensely interesting is DeLeo's implicit criticism of Cage's compositional techniques regarding silence and indeterminacy, that DeLeo finds it necessary to construct and separate sound events in a highly deterministic manner to get sound back clean. I've had the experience, and I imagine I'm not alone, of listening to one of Cage's indeterminate, silence-rich later works and mentally composing teleologies and relationships among the randomly scattered sounds. It's as though DeLeo's position is that we are such pattern-seeking creatures that mere randomness will not suffice to keep us from constructing a grammar of sound in real time as we listen, and that overcoming this tendency requires the composer to carefully construct a work that confounds us in highly intentional ways. Perhaps this shouldn't be surprising, though. We look at the night sky and make constellations out of the stars. The duty of the poet is to overcome the blank page. I doubt that's possible. Nicanor Parra. In the spring of 2011, Stuart Saunders Smith, who is here with us today, and so I will speak with care, retired from the music faculty at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County after teaching there for 36 years. He now lives in Sharon, Vermont. His wife, Sylvia Smith, is a well-known percussionist and music publisher. She owns Smith Publications and Sonic Arts Editions, which publishes music by many important American composers, including Milton Babbitt, Thomas DeLeo, Ben Johnston, Pauline Oliveros, Stuart Saunders Smith, and James Tenney. Stuart's catalog is now near or over 150 works, many of which, especially more recent ones, exist only in manuscript. As with Cage and DeLeo, Smith's thinking about silence is inextricably tied up in his notions of listening. And as with DeLeo, one need only scratch the surface to find a complex relationship with Cage. Quote, "Music centered in listening, regardless of its notational strategies, is the disciplined development and exploration of the corporeal sound imprint. Listening to the inner recognizes that the intelligence of sound leaves imprints, living sound fossils of fibrous roots, infixed deep in restless twists, which can be mined by leaving the mind, by listening into the silence, not the cage silence of non-intention, but Norman O'Brown's silence is our mother tongue, the silence of the abyss, the nothing." Where to begin? Cage's famous anechoic chamber anecdote throws immediate doubt onto any notion of silence as an abyss or a nothing, and it's hard to imagine Cage agreeing with an idea of the intelligence of sound. Additionally, Cage addressed inner listening in the same interview that provided the opening quote of this talk. Quote, "People expect listening to be more than listening, and so sometimes they speak of inner listening or the meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer." This distinction that Cage and Smith draw between inner and outer listening is similar to the distinction that Lamont Young makes between his own music and Cage's in Elliot Kaplan's 1991 film, Cage Cunningham. Young emphasizes the different focal qualities of meditation in Cage's Zen Buddhism, which is wide open, multifocal, and embracing of all in its perceptive field, and Young's own yogic practice, which is narrow, unifocal, and excludes peripheral entities in favor of a central one. To spiritually remap Cage's and Smith's differences in this regard, one should consider Smith's Quaker faith in place of Young's yogic practice. I had the pleasure of attending a Quaker meeting with Stuart and Sylvia in June of 2011. I was in town helping them pack for their move to Vermont, and on Sunday morning they invited me to accompany them to meeting. My mother's family's Roman Catholic background immediately asserted itself, and I said that my jeans, linen shirt, and sneakers could not possibly be appropriate attire for church. But they assured me that simple dress was part of Quaker practice and that it was no problem. The meeting we attended was fairly typical in many ways, lasting about an hour, without any clergy or leader, all pews facing the center of the room, and mostly silent, with people occasionally rising to speak, to give messages when inspired to do so. The end of the service is marked by someone rising to shake the hands of their neighbors, which is followed by general handshaking and well-wishing throughout the room and retiring to a communal lunch. When I talked afterward with Stuart and Sylvia, we mostly discussed the listening that takes place not when someone else is speaking, but when the meeting hall is silent, the same kind of inner listening or listening into the silence that Smith mentions above. It is precisely waiting for the silence of the light. In his compositions, Smith includes periods of silence as opportunities for listeners to synthesize responses to the music in a considered, reflective manner. These periods of silence are necessary to cultivate the kind of attention that Smith's ideal listener would have, as it is near impossible to synthesize reflective thoughts about Smith's music while it is sounding, especially as it is often highly chromatic, rhythmically complex, and texturally dense. The eighth movement of Smith's 2008 piece, Wait, for solo marimba, contains just such a period of silence as described above, as well as a passage of music that following from that reflective silence as a Quaker message might. You can see a silence period there, followed by a short coda. The passage of music immediately following the 5 quarter rests that start the second system is marked a way, maybe. I posited to Stewart that the music that followed those rests could work as a message does, insofar as messages are largely observational and contingent offerings, free of dogma, positive but incomplete, and that his textual marking might confirm this, offering the musical passage as a possible way forward out of some musical or personal dilemma. He agreed, though he was quick to point out that, like messages in Quaker meetings, no such dilemma could be as clearly defined and no real solution offered as aphoristically as this passage might imply. A similar passage of silence occurs in Winter Taps, a 2005 composition for 2 speaking vibraphonists. Winter Taps is an example that Smith refers to as music of coexistence, wherein performers are provided parts that are performed simultaneously, but without concern for moment-by-moment synchronicity. Smith finds various means to keep performers roughly together in his coexistence pieces. His solution in Winter Taps is for each performer to play a series of bracketed, numbered passages in order, waiting for his or her partner to arrive at the end of a correspondingly numbered event before continuing. In addition, Winter Taps contains numbered events marked RU. Such passages are to be performed in rhythmic unison, though each part contains different pitch material. Event number 12 in the second section of this piece is such an event to be performed in rhythmic unison, even though each player performs 8 quarter rests and makes no sound. As in Wait, Smith places this reflective period of silence near the end of the work, as though the silence is a sort of culminating moment, followed by a brief coda to mark the end of the piece. The fact that this silence is a positive, performative act made by 2 performers acting in concert and community helps to draw a stronger connection between the work and the deep communal silence of Quaker meeting. Perhaps this use of silence is best summed up by Smith himself in the first movement of the Such Falling Voice. I wait. I wait, and in the waiting, the lyric. In the waiting, the song. John Cage will always have an important place in conversations about musical silence. As Tom DeLeo admits, Cage, of course, is the real source of all consideration of silence in music. But a wider exploration of phenomenologies of musical silence is in order, given that the small slices of Tom's and Stewart's work presented herein are just glimpses of promising new inquiries, examinations of the role of silence in more discursive musics, comparisons to be made to the role of silence in language and utterance, building on the work of Martin Heidegger, Max Picard, and Bernard Dauenhauer, and the discussion of other artists who use silence in unconventional ways, such as Luigi Nono, Harold Pinter, Robert Rauschenberg, Richard Chartier, and others. Whatever the direction of future research, however, the very opening of Cage's lecture on commitment offers us valuable advice as we move forward. In order to fulfill all of our commitments, we need more ears and eyes than we had originally. Thank you. Do we have time to take a question? Okay. Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you for sharing. That's really interesting. I just wanted to ask a question, I guess, in terms of application to performance. Often passages of silence as a performer might be really uncomfortable. They're just difficult. And I was wondering if you have any insight about how young performers and young teachers can help ourselves and our students become comfortable with those silences.
That's a really fabulous, it's a really fabulous question with a really fabulous point inside it, that I think that it's not only a matter of discomfort for performers and teachers, but also for certain audiences. When I've played some of these works, I've noticed audiences getting uncomfortable, and then sometimes that discomfort will manifest itself audibly, usually by giggling, which leads to that horrible misinterpretation of all of this music, including 433, is that, well, it makes people laugh, so it must be a joke, which is certainly not the case. I think that there's a simple answer to your question, but because it's simple, it's not necessarily easy, and that is the cultivation of a belief in the rightness of the silence that is just as strong as a commitment to any of the notes that you're playing. I don't know if that's short and unsatisfying, but it's what I believe. There's really, if you're going to do it right, there's no shortcut. That you have to believe in the silence that you're creating, and that the effect of that silence is going to be what you want it to be, just as much as a right note at the right time with the right touch is going to be right. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask about whether you had anything to say about the Japanese notion of ma, the word ma, and in its relationship to what you talked about today.
I don't, because I'm not that familiar with it. Maybe you and I should sit down at the next break. Because it sounds like there's a really fabulous idea in there, and I would like to share it. Yeah, thanks.
I'm glad. Thank you so much for a wonderful paper. And I would like to follow a little bit on what Eugene was saying. Is there a way of looking at American experimentalism that is not as a binary against European modernism? It seems like we've been living with that paradigm for so long. And so interjecting something that comes from neither the United States nor Europe feels refreshing.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, except where you say neither, I see both. I see DeLeo's music as this, as sort of a mix that is just one element that breaks that paradigm down. That it's not as useful a way of looking at things as it maybe was 15 or 20 years ago. No, I absolutely agree with you that I would much rather deal with dichotomies of things that are good and things that aren't than things that are from America and things that are from Europe. Okay, well, thank you so much.